In the book The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, Mark Twain famously wrote, "Beautiful credit, the foundation of modern society. Who shall say that this is not the golden age of mutual trust, of unlimited reliance upon human promises?" This was a satirical shot, of course, fired at American society in the post-Civil War. When we look at the turn of the century, we see progress, industrialization, and thriving country. That progress and prosperity, a mere illusion, built on something that was far less stable. So this period that we're talking about is the American Gilded Age, of course. A time when the United States was growing and industrializing at a very rapid pace. Railroads expanded across the country, factories grew in major cities, and a handful of individuals built massive fortunes. Individuals like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, George Pullman, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and so on dominated entire industries. At this point, over 50% of the wealth was owned by 1% of the people. The mighty American dollar and its political machine rolled through every level of government, all the way to Washington. While the people doing the labor were dealing with long hours, low pay, and pretty unsafe working conditions. So what are the American people to do when they see a system where economic power and political power are deeply connected and usually working in the same direction? A single direction that goes on to keep them under their boot? How does a movement and a single man define American labor? Americans were starting to get fed up, but their complaints would entirely fall on deaf ears. That gap shows up very clearly in the politics of the time. Business leaders maintained preferable conditions for growth with little interference. Tammany Hall, being one of the biggest organizations of this time for stuff like this, had a vice grip on politics in the late 19th century. They shaped the outcomes and controlled decisions all from behind the scenes. The expectations of the railroad industry continued to consolidate corporate power as companies gained control over transportation networks essential to economic development. This dynamic is illustrated by Thomas Nast, a political cartoonist of the Golden Age who drew Power Behind the Throne. It depicts a man of Boss Tweed, the famous Tammany man, as New York's ruler, displaying him as larger than elected officials, surrounded by wealth and control. It reflected the widespread public recognition that democracy was in the pocket of the elites, the unelected power brokers. What's important here is that this wasn't some hidden conspiracy at the time. People were aware of it. It was a part of how the system actually functioned. Furthermore was Senator George W. Plunkett. He famously said, "Everybody is talking these days about Tammany men growing rich on graft. There's an honest graft, and I'm an example of how it works. I might sum up the whole thing by saying, I've seen my opportunities, and I took them." From his perspective, it wasn't really corruption. It was just taking advantage of opportunities that came with being in power. This is the true definition of power behind the throne. And that's kind of the key point. When the system allows that behavior, it stops looking like corruption and it starts looking normal. So the rapid expansion of all of these industries led to big corporations trying to consolidate all the power in one place. The first trust being born in 1882 with Standard Oil trying to buy up everyone and driving out smaller businesses into bankruptcy. The floodgates were now open, and it was up to Congress to try to close them. It threatened free trade and commerce, so in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. The very first line of the act stated that every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states, or with foreign nations, is hereby declared illegal. Keep this in mind for later. The thing is, it didn't have any teeth. On paper, the law was supposed to limit monopolies and protect competition. It sounds like a direct response to growing power in big corporations, but in practice, it didn't really function that way. The language was broad, enforcement was inconsistent, and in many cases, it didn't seriously challenge the largest companies at all. It created the appearance that something was being done, but didn't actually do anything. While all of this is happening, workers are dealing with the realities of industrial life still. They're organizing, they're forming unions, and they're trying to push for better conditions. And as those movements start to grow, so does the tension between labor and industry. Events like the Haymarket Affair and the Homestead Strike show how quickly these conflicts could escalate and how often the response framed workers as dangerous or disruptive. That breaking point came in 1894 in the railroad town of Pullman, Illinois. The Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages by nearly 30% while maintaining high rents and prices of goods in its company town. Workers were pushed into an economic despair. In response, they walked out, and the strike quickly escalated into a nationwide boycott led by Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union. So this small act of defiance and people being fed up with being walked all over on was now at the national stage. And it did some actual damage. Transportation in America was at a gridlock. People all over the nation were walking off job sites and others refusing to service trains with Pullman's luxury cars. It hurt Pullman's pockets. It also had the side effect of stopping the flow of goods and mail. At this moment, when labor challenged not just a company, it also challenged the economic system itself. And personally, the real kicker for me is George Pullman, with no attempt to even talk with his workers or arbitrate a deal with the ARU. He immediately went to the government. A responsibility of the federal government is to regulate interstate commerce. That's what something like the Sherman Antitrust Act was needed. Pullman's inability to work out a deal with the strikers should have held him liable. Instead, the government framed the strikers as the ones who were violating the law. Grover Cleveland received major political pressure to do something about the strike. In his ear was Attorney General Richard Olney, a man who had close ties to the railroad industry, working as a railroad lawyer, and was not only friends with Pullman, but also in contact with him during the actual crisis. Olney pushes for a court injunction to end the strike. Just like the cries of the people to have their civil liberties protected, this injunction too fell on deaf ears. When Debs refused, he was arrested. And in one fell swoop, the government effectively cut the head off of the snake, and the strike ended very soon after. This is where we get into the fun part. The court case Henry Debs, which kinda defined the Gilded Age, in my opinion. So, Debs challenged the legality of his imprisonment because his habeas corpus was disbanded. The Supreme Court upheld the federal government's actions, arguing that it both had the authority and the responsibility to ensure the free flow of interstate commerce. Writing for the court, Justice David J. Brewer insisted that this was not an attack on labor or defense of corporate interests, but a necessary step to preserve national order. The outcome tells a different story, however. The injunctions didn't just restore rail traffic, it crushed the strike, dismantling an organized resistance and ensuring the economic machinery driving industrial profit could continue uninterrupted. Bottom line is the government has the sole authority and the responsibility to regulate interstate commerce. However, I believe it failed in doing so, and the Supreme Court failed the people with one simple piece of evidence. Pullman never negotiated with strikers. He refused to even meet with Debs and the ARU when they got involved. If the government truly wanted to be a neutral arbiter, like Brewer said, then arbitrate a deal between the workers and Pullman. Protect your constituents and resume the flow of interstate commerce. Pullman played a part in the chaos. He was not a victim, but the cause of the strike. The only thing that Debs did was make good trouble. The most revealing aspect of Henry Debs is how the government used the very thing that was meant to keep people like Pullman in check. The Sherman Antitrust Act, a law meant to break up monopolies, was turned against labor unions, while corporations like Pullman faced no comparable restraint. This decision is critical because it turns a pattern into a principle. The government intervention in favor of economic stability was no longer just a reaction. That's the real legacy of the Gilded Age. Laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act created the appearance of control. The political machine in Tammany Hall ensured the influence remained intact, and decisions like Henry Debs provided legal authority to suppress those who had challenged it. In the end, the government did not simply side with corporations. It built a system in which power could continue with minimal resistance. And while these choices may have preserved order in the moment, they also exposed inequalities so deeply rooted that they could not be ignored forever. Because when a system is designed to maintain power rather than challenge it, conflict is not an exception. It's inevitable.